like to introduce Jerome Marty, the Project Director at the Council of Canadian Academies. And Dr. Marty will speak briefly about the CCA's process and will introduce the chair of the expert panel's report, Mr. Scott Vaughn. All right, I'll leave it over to you, Jerome.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. It's noon exactly. Bonjour à tous. And thank you for joining us today for a short overview of the report, Building a Resilient Canada, Bâtir un Canada Résilient, authored by the expert panel on disaster resilience in a changing climate, and published by the CCA, the Council of Canadian Academies. Just a few words to say that the CCA is an NGO funded by three of the academies in Canada, the Royal Society of Canada, the Canadian Academy of Engineering, and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. This report was sponsored by Public Safety Canada and co-sponsored by many other federal departments. And it was released last month on the CCA website, and it can be retrieved in both French and English on the CCA website. 11 experts were part of this journey that lasts about 2 years. And these experts had experience in both disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. And we are here today to hear an overview of the report with Scott Vaughn, who was and is still the chair of that panel. And Scott is also a senior fellow with the International Institute of Sustainable Development. And Scott, I'm going to share my screen now up to you with the presentation. I can do the first two slides.
Great,
just to introduce the charge and the panel. A CCA's report starts with a question that is submitted to the panel. The main question here for this assessment was the one you see here on the top of the screen. What key opportunities exist to improve disaster resilience in Canada through better integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation research and practice? There were three sub-questions. One that aimed at looking at barriers to such integration. A second question that it was asking us and the panel to look at tools and data sets that could promote such integration. And finally, another question that was about looking at the capabilities that may exist to enhance resilience to climate-related disasters in the future. As I mentioned in the introductions, 11 experts from various backgrounds, from academia, from the private sector, from the insurance sector, worked together for about 2 years, 16 months. And Scott was the chair of the panel and is going to continue now with the key findings of the report. Up to you, Scott.
Great, good. Thank you. Very great pleasure to join colleagues. So thanks very much for inviting us. I'll just go through less than 10 minutes. I see the report has been shared now in English and French in the chat. So as Jerome said, the charge was to look at opportunities to integrate two complementary but distinct disciplines, areas of program funding between the DRR community and climate adaptation community. The key finding of the report is that there's an ongoing failure to fully integrate those two bodies, as it were. And therefore, among the consequences of that is a loss of efficiency from a range of different issues needed to build up resilience for current and emerging climate-related natural hazards. Next slide, please. So we've looked at, and I think as Jerome just said, what the panel looked at was looking at, why those two areas are not as well connected as they should be. Part of it is historical, part of it is orientation of DRR communities tend to be centralized command and control, short-term focus on preparation and response to emergencies. Climate adaptation tends to be more longer term, horizontal focus on inclusion, and a focus on prevention, and therefore looking at what are opportunities to bridge those. And we looked at three. There certainly weren't the only ones one can look at to build better integration, but the three we did look at was better data and information, better financing, which really interesting, the previous panel, as well as whole of society responses. Next slide, please. So just on the first one, and this is around information, and I'm not going to be able to go into all of them because of time, but it's really this idea of the critical importance of information, of data, information, and knowledge, in order that people essentially are looking at the same page, as it were, in terms of how we think about risk, how we think about recent and current episodes of disasters, what we think about different solutions, and then also how to look at intermediaries between highly technical information coming from climate and other meteorological modeling, and how does that reach city planners, engineers, architects, local communities, etc. And just to say at the beginning that an important part of information, which clearly is now we think about a lot in the last 2 years because of COVID, is not only that information needs to be timely, it has to be accessible, it obviously has to be robust, but it also has to be trusted. And then we're seeing now a general erosion in trust amongst segments of the community on distrusting expert information. So we looked at 6 areas of this. The first one is Canada's disaster database. Essentially said that it doesn't meet the criteria that I've just mentioned, timeliness, accessibility, etc. And the panel noted that it was severely limited. There's different examples of databases that do cover natural hazards. And there's also within the federal government, there's clear protocols from Treasury Board and elsewhere on how to build robust and comparable data systems. The second one is nature-based solutions, which I know you've been talking about, and the panel has looked at different examples of nature-based solutions in Canada as well as around the world. I think there's the panel's view was that these provide tremendous opportunity in the future, as well as now they're expanding, and also in the future. I mean, a challenge with nature-based solutions. The many different databases that basically track thousands of different project level nature-based solutions as well as policies. There's a real issue with how do you measure them, and standardized system of measurement in order to get some kind of comparable system to measure the performance outcomes of nature-based solutions. And this isn't only a challenge in Canada, it's a challenge around the world. There's work, for example, at the Global Environment Facility. They did an assessment, I believe in 2021, on how they thought about the measurement of their natural-based system solutions. It's sort of a narrow way of saying, how do they perform compared, for example, to investments in gray infrastructure, but then also thinking about it in a wider sense in the context of natural capital and inclusive wealth and others. The third one is economic analysis. I mean, one of the main observations of the panel is that governments typically underinvest in prevention and more on post-event recovery. Part of this is just because the economic analysis, while clear, needs to get a stronger foothold. So among the analyses the report mentions is that $1 spent on prevention, for example, in putting in backwater valves in household basements, can lead to $11 in avoided costs down the road. But just to say that this economic analysis, there's a great opportunity to sort of further this as well as make it well known. For me, among the most really interesting parts of the panel have been Indigenous and local knowledge. And just to say this should be a sort of a full focus of future work, but just to say among the observations of the panel is that Indigenous and local knowledge should be a distinct form of looking at how to build resilience in Canada. There were examples that we noted where traditional practices like cultural burning appear to have led to a reduction in wildfire and other risks. The last two things is this question of all hazard risk assessment. We know from the IPCC and elsewhere that natural hazards don't happen in isolation, as the last panel just mentioned. And so the importance of looking at an all hazard risk assessment, and the panel notes that compared to other OECD countries, Canada can do quite a bit better, not only in looking at the underlying methodology on how it looks at all hazards risk assessment, as well as making that publicly available, which it is not now. And then the final one I've just mentioned is the important role of knowledge brokers. There's plenty of examples here in Canada, the Prairie Climate Centre, the Climate Atlas of Canada, as well as experts that are being able to work with different disciplines to say, what do the risks mean to me as a homeowner, as a business, as a community, etc. Next slide, please. The second one, which your previous panel again just mentioned, so I won't go into it a lot, is just the critical role of financing. So one is, you've just talked about, is the role of private insurance. This is moving. There's companies that are giving preferential offerings, but at the same time, that remains a challenge. I think, again, Canada compared to other countries, there's still sort of fairly large gaps in the number of offerings, for example, on flood risk, or as well as saltwater or coastal flooding. So there's only two companies in Canada that cover that. One of the areas that we looked at is, the opportunity for public-private sector partnerships in order to help close some of those gaps, in order basically to encourage the private sector to move into some of those areas that are not covered by private insurance, as well as looking at some de-risk. There's an example from the United States where the US federal government has backstopped a wider flood risk insurance, which is available to homeowners. The only other thing I'll mention from this slide, I know you've talked about disaster relief as well as public infrastructure. The federal government has been doing a lot on integrating climate resilience within the public infrastructure, on provincial transfer payments and others. So that's an area which is very welcome. The one area I'll just mention is corporate risk disclosure. For those of you that are following work of TCFD, now requiring Canada, and as well as G7 countries and others, requiring the financial sector to disclose their climate risk. That's primarily around climate risk related to carbon assets and issues around stranded assets, et cetera. But in addition, looking at that guidance, it's also to disclose physical risks related to climate-related natural disasters. So that's going to be another new area of data and information which is going to be available. And in all things, it's how to sort of weave this together. And so last slide, please. So the last slide is just to echo the former panel, is just the importance of whole of society collaboration, and given the magnitude of risks that all Canadians across the country, in every region, every province, every town, every region are facing. There's no single agency that is able to do this alone. And so the critical importance of having better coordination and coherence in different levels of government. And what we looked at was the role, for example, of the federal government in supporting things that I've just mentioned, better data, more timely data, as well as making it accessible to different actors across the country, as well as a critical role on federal funding. There's a number of different recent initiatives the federal government has announced related to building in prevention into rebuilding and climate resilience, both within Indigenous communities, infrastructure, and other areas. I think, as the last panel just mentioned, what we all know is that the best decisions on building resilience happen at the local level. and so thinking about the role of the federal government in those transfers, looking at how the federal framework will evolve. But we looked at examples where there's real innovation happening at the local level. I'll just mention one, which we noted, there's many others, but in the province of Nova Scotia, the provincial government required as a condition for accessing a new source of funding that the only way a community or a town or a county could access that funding was that they themselves had to develop a climate adaptation strategy, which would look at the local circumstances within that town and that region in order to develop it. So with that is one example of many in how do you actually sort of get different levels of jurisdictions involved. And again, the important role that the panel emphasized on the role of First Nations and Indigenous communities, particularly in the context of reconciliation in supporting their rights to develop their own resilience plans. And finally, last is the role of many other areas, the role of regulations, codes, and standards, which are happening from other bodies, standard setting bodies for building codes and others. So that in a nutshell was the panel report. As I said, it can be found in the chat box or on the CCI website. And it was really a great pleasure to work with the CCA, with the council secretariat colleagues, really, really outstanding professionals, and with the panel members. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, for this overview. And I think we can take, we have a few minutes to take questions from the audience, if there are some. And maybe waiting for one to come up, Scott. I think the panel had a lot of discussion about the idea, the popular idea of build back better and potential alternative, and to evaluate how it applied in the context of disasters. Would you like to comment or share what the panel had in mind with with it?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the areas the panel looked at was under the current programs for funding programs, for example, understandably, you want to get the money out the door as quickly as possible in order to rebuild generally similar structures in the same location. And given the changing nature of risk, which we spent quite a bit of time talking about, is clarity on that definition. I mean, and what we've said is this is an opportunity to build different structures that are more resilient, but also not in the same place if possible. So this question of relocation or managed retreat were areas. So basically, given the number of dynamics related to changing risk, this is an area where there's hundreds of millions of dollars which are being spent generally annually. And so one of the findings was don't do the same thing in the same place, because you're going to be facing the same impacts in the future.
Thank you. One question that came in that is quite relevant, as Canada works a lot with the United States, is there are lots of relationship between the two countries, and the question is, how can different countries work together? I think we saw some impacts of flood and water management in the United States impacting in the BC landscape recently. There is also the Great Lakes Basin. We work together, Canada and the US, together in one basin. So are there some lessons or recommendations to promote international collaborations when they are needed for disasters?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of one of the big, I mean, for those of you who have been working on climate resilience, climate adaptation for years, I mean, I've always felt that climate adaptation has been sort of the poor cousin of climate mitigation and decarbonization. I mean, obviously, absolutely critically important. I mean, I think one of the big things that came out of the Glasgow COP meeting a couple of months ago was just this need to elevate adaptation at the international agenda because of the risk where, global averages are 1.1 degrees Celsius above averages. Canada's at 1.7. Though I think there's different platforms now on looking at sharing particularly, sharing not only information, but also supporting project financing to developing countries, for example, through the GCF, through the World Bank, through Jeff and others. But within the Canada context, lots of different areas of cooperation. I mean, one is just sharing information on emerging practices. And one that we noted, one of the, again, your panel mentioned it, the previous panel, is that we know that climate impacts don't affect Canadians in the same way, in the same locations. There's underlying structural issues around social and other inequalities. The Biden administration with FEMA, a directive in 2021, directed FEMA to go back and say, go and analyze where racism has affected FEMA responses, and moving forward, how to build greater equity into disaster response in the future. And I think that that's an area that is one of many that is useful to share between the United States and Canada, US, Europe, Australia, and African countries as well, looking at nature-based solutions. So lots of different things. The Global Commission on Adaptation was a really good platform in order to look at how to share information, and many others. My colleagues at IISD run a national adaptation platform, which works with many, many countries on emerging practices in different sectors.
Thank you. We have a question from Marjorie Browns, who is involved in community-based adaptations and DRR activities at the local level. And Marjorie is asking, are there any community accessible tools and organizations that you recommend we look towards to support these efforts?
It's a great question. I mean, a lot of these tools are online, Marjorie, as you know, but maybe I mean, just thinking about the Nova Scotia example, those tools can be, many of them are geared to sort of pan-Canadian sort of data trends. I mean, one tool, obviously, the federal government is in the process now of updating their flood risk mapping, is one example. And there's other examples on looking at fire hazard maps and also different regional platforms, which actually try to sort of zero in on what does all this data mean at the sort of local or regional level. I mean, one that I mentioned before, the Prairie Climate Center, for example, looked at what does climate change or climate risk look like, for example, from the perspectives of the prairies, perspective of the farming and other communities in the prairie region. And I think what that sort of mapping and other work is done is connect the data with maps, but also connect it with narratives. So say, what does this mean to a neighbor in Saskatchewan, and how can that sort of information sharing be useful?
Thank you, Scott. I think we're going to transition to the next presentation for this program. I want to thank everyone attending. Thank you, Laura and the CatIQ team for allowing this presentation. And again, you can find the report online in both en français and in English. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott and Jerome.